Good morning and welcome to today's episode of A Slice of Medieval. I know I say this a lot, but we do have a real treat today. I think every episode is a real treat, which is probably why I say it a lot. But today we are joined by Richard Townsley, who just happens to be Sherwood Forest's very own Sheriff of Nottingham. Oh, darn, I forgot to put dastardly Sheriff of Nottingham, because the Sheriff of Nottingham is always dastardly, isn't he, Richard?
I think the sheriff is not dastardly at all. He's an honest, hard-working government servant who was much maligned.
I can see that. He wasn't as dastardly as the Robin Hood legend would have us believe then, was he?
I mean, one of the interesting things about that is we know the name of pretty well every sheriff for almost 1,000 years, but he's never named in the legend, so we can't actually pin it on any individual. The sheriffs were never popular. It's an unpopular job, isn't it? Being policeman, car park enforcement officer and tax collector. None of these people win popularity contests.
I suppose that's the thing, and the Robin Hood legend, the one we all know of is Richard the Lionheart, King John, Robin Hood. But he goes on to something like the reign of Edward II, doesn't it? It's not fixed to one period.
I think Robin Hood is later. The King John and Richard is a 16th century invention. It's Mundy, the playwright who placed him in that era. So again, Robin Hood, it's a moving feast. We can put him in a period over 200 years. But that's one of the sort of frustrations, I suppose, with the legend. If they'd have named a sheriff, which I think is telling, isn't it? He's not a particular sheriff. There were some very interesting sheriffs. Philip Mark is one of my favourite names. His name crops up, and he's a good example, I think. Specifically named in Magna Carta as somebody. There's a clause saying, "Get rid of this person." Yeah. 800 years later, his name's in print as somebody we want rid of. That's quite an achievement. And oddly, when he was appointed by King John, there was a debt. There's all these. Part of the role of the sheriff is to collect in money, what's called the farm or the shire. And most that's not really tax as such as we think of it. It's more like revenues, rents and fees and things like that. So there was some outstanding money from Newark. Newark hadn't paid this money for a few years, and it was just cropping up on the pipe rolls. It was, Nottingham owes it, and why hasn't it been paid? Philip Mark, the debt had been there for a long time under lots of previous sheriffs. They'd not been able to get the money. Mark just went to Newark, grabbed a couple of citizens, took them back to Nottingham, threw them in the jail and said, when the money arrives, these people can go free. The money duly arrived, he let them free, and he handed the money into the exchequer. So from the King's point of view, that's a great sheriff, isn't it? But from Newark's point of view, they're going to hate him forever, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, a good sheriff is all in the eye of the beholder. And interesting with Mark, although he's named in Magna Carta, he isn't got rid of. And at the death of John, he carries on under his son. And then there's a little reference somewhere where his wife is saying, you promised a pension, and that was duly forthcoming. The suggestion is he was buried at Lenton Priory.
Yeah.
So even in death, they're honouring his duty because they're paying the pension. They could have just, so no. He turned out he was a baddie all along, and we're not giving you the money.
Yeah, and of course, the day before John's death, on the 18th of October, just literally a few hours before he died, he appointed a certain Nicola de la Haye as Sheriff of Lincolnshire, with Philip Mark as under-sheriff to help her out. So...
and again, that I was talking to someone the other day, and I was saying, of all the evil we throw at John, I mean, not a nice character. He did this, women's emancipation act of appointing Nicola. I suspect that what he's doing is that Nicola's the figurehead sheriff, but he's putting some muscle behind, saying, look, if you mess about with Nicola and you think you can bend the rules because she's a woman, Philip Mark can visit you and sort and sort you out.
Yeah, the enforcer. Nicholas Enforcer.
The iron glove, whichever you prefer.
Yeah. It's funny though, because I've been reading up on Matilda de Coes,
Yes.
and she was it the keeper of Sherwood Forest?
Hereditary keeper, yes. And
Yeah.
another one of John's confirmations of a woman in a very unique role.
Yeah, except she lost the job after her husband died. And the articles I've been reading have said because she was a woman. And I thought John wouldn't take her out of a job because she was a woman. So I'm guessing she was actually in opposition to him at some point.
She lost it to Mark, actually. Philip Mark is, and I think what happened is she had it through her husband. Her husband died. She wants to keep it as a widow. And then John marries her to one of his cronies, and he then takes on the role. And then when he dies, she's arguing with John to keep it in her name so that she can pass it to a son of her first marriage. So she does actually get it confirmed in her name.
Oh, brilliant.
And I think she is a loyalist to John. And similar to Nicola, they both got wonderful tombs. You can actually visit gravestones, one at Brampton and which is just outside Chesterfield, and the one in Lincolnshire. They're both well worth a visit.
Yeah, I'm going to do Matilda de Coes' tomb this summer.
Yes.
Because I saw it in your post on Facebook and I thought I need to go there. But thank you, because you've just cleared up some research that I was doing last week.
She had it, lost it, and had it again. And I think it's to do with she was remarried, and then in medieval times, everything that the wife for him, so he takes it on, and then he dies, and she's arguing to keep it back from the original marriage.
And of course, she has an aunt called Matilda de Coes as well, which also causes problems.
You'll know much more about this better than me. So, if the medieval people had managed to have more variety in their names, it'd make researching a lot easier, wouldn't it?
Oh, it would. It certainly would. Oh, thank you for clearing up that piece of research.
Well, I look forward to the book. So
thank you. Medieval rebel women. That's what it's going to be. So
they're not rebels, are they?
No, well, that's going to be the argument. But it's women who stand up for their own rights.
Yes, again, that's interesting. With the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta's reissue this year.
Yeah,
the right for women to widows to not be forced to marry and keep their inheritances is one of the clauses, isn't it?
You've mentioned a few aspects of the sheriff's job, collecting taxes and fees and so on. Was it broader than that? What other role did he have? Was there a social role or a judicial role?
The key to the role, I think, is to remember that unlike now, when government is big, there is government officers, government people employed by the government, police, all sorts of people in every town and district. Medieval England, that didn't happen. There's a small core of government people at the centre, often mobile. They're moving around with the king, and the only agent in the locality in the shire was the sheriff. So anything that the government needed doing, which meant the king, fell to the sheriff. So one very simple, easy thing going back to Philip Mark is King John sends some wine. I think there's 5 tons of wine, 5 big barrels. They come up the River Humber to Newark. They can't go any further because the river isn't deep enough. And there's a simple instruction to Mark to say, collect the wine from Newark and deliver it to Nottingham Castle. So it's if you were some high and mighty sheriff, I think, well, hang on, that's an errand boy job. That's a sort of go to the stores for a long wait.
Yeah.
But that's the king commands and you obey. And Mark would have dropped everything and done that because that's what John told him to do. If the wine didn't arrive, or 4 barrels arrived instead of 5, it's Mark that's got to answer for that. It could mean you'd answer with your head if you weren't careful. So yeah, it's any job that the king wanted. There are a few routine jobs, and the more I read about the role of the sheriff, the more I sympathise with the guy. And I think they died bow-legged because they must have spent most of their life on a horse. It's not the age of messaging and phones and things. So just think of that writ. That writ has come from the king, wherever he was delivered by messenger. So that there was no pager. So they were unlikely to find the sheriff. So I suspect those writs went to the Shire Hall, which is in Nottingham. where the sheriff's office was, his clerks were, and his own messengers. So they're delivering it to them. They're recording the message, they're logging that they've received it or whatever they do. They're going to have to translate it. I suspect most of these sheriffs didn't read Latin. Then they're going to sort of say, well, okay, now we need to find, where is the sheriff? Where was he last seen? Where was he on his way to? And then his own messengers. So they're going to have to track him down wherever he is. Very interestingly for Nottinghamshire, although we talk about the Sheriff of Nottingham, he was also always Sheriff of Derbyshire. The two were joined, one sheriff for 2 shires. So that's a huge area. They have to track him down, deliver the message, read it, translate it, whatever they needed to do, and then Mark has got to execute it by himself going to Newark to physically supervise this task or send a trusted assistant. And there is a lot of evidence of under sheriffs and deputies. So I think there's quite a team of people around the sheriff. So yeah, a lot of day-to-day business. One of the things that the sheriffs were criticised for, they had to do what's called a sheriff's tour, which is a tour around the shires, and to visit the 100 courts to make sure the 100 courts are functioning properly. And if you didn't attend your 100 court, you could be fined and pay a fine, which the sheriff collected. So he was very keen to make sure that money rolled in. So there was a lot of criticism of the sheriff visiting more often than he should, staying longer than the court. So, if the sheriff is visiting one of the Derbyshire hundreds, he's not going to stay in a local hotel, is he? He's going to place himself in Haddon Hall. And that means somebody's got to feed him. He's got to be, he's going to expect good food, good wine. His horses are going to need to be fed and watered. He's going to have an entourage. So, you're going to see the sheriff trotting up the lane thinking, oh, my goodness, here he comes. I'm going to empty the larder. And again, those were petitions presented to the king. The sheriff can only stay X nights and cannot bring more than 10. Why is he bringing his wife? And we've got to feed her as well. Like Elizabeth I when she did progress. It was a great honour, but it could bankrupt a family. And I think similar for the sheriff. He was often an unwelcome guest, and we wanted rid of him. And I think that the earliest one, the earliest kind of name we have for a sheriff of Nottingham is William Peveril, which is obviously one of the henchmen of William the Conqueror. And at that point, the sheriff needed to be a very strong arm. We needed a military man capable of wielding a sword, capable of holding an area. And Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire would be a frontier, the more unruly, more wild, less settled to the Norman conquest. This would have been a border. And you'd need an iron hand to hold it. And I think Peveril provided that. There's little evidence of Saxon rebellion in these shires, unlike Yorkshire, our neighbours just up the road. Possibly, Peveril had a firm grip and kept it. As the rule of the Normans settled, we don't need a military man. It's less relevant. Yeah. You need them on the marches, and that carried on for very much later. This is a Midland shire, more settled. It then becomes more about the revenue. The king is then thinking, don't necessarily need a military guy, but I do need somebody who can add up and can collect those pennies in. And I think the other thing they learned with sheriffs quite quickly, Peveril seems to have been keeper of the forest. He had the forest responsibility and the sheriff's job, and was the constable of the castle, particularly Nottingham. And I think they learned that putting that much power into one hand, one person, can cause resentment and rebellion. So, they learned then to split those jobs up. So for most of the medieval period, the Sheriff of Nottingham is not associated with the castle. Although in all the films, of course, is the centre of it. And the Sheriff in Nottingham certainly operated out of Shire Hall.
That's interesting, because I think they do have, there's this tendency to assume the sheriff is the one who controls the local castle. And in some cases, like when Nicola was sheriff, she was also already Castellan of Lincoln Castle. So yes, they were centred there. But usually the castle belongs to except for the royal castles, it tends to belong to the Earl of the area rather than the sheriff anyway, doesn't it?
Yes, the Saxon role of sheriff, which is where we get, the shire reeve, there was a sort of triumvirate of people trying to manage the local area. And that was bishop and earl. And between those two, the earl is the more powerful. He has armed men behind him. He's very dominant, in the local area. So the king's interest could easily get pushed aside in there. So they wanted a sheriff, a reeve, the king's reeve, to sit in amongst those people. So he's representing the king's voice. And probably the weakest of those three would be the sheriff, because he's got the backing of the king, but the king is a long way away. The earls could get away with stuff. The Normans they kept the role of sheriff and appointed their own people into it, and they learned that it worked well, and particularly when it came then to the declining power of the earls. The earls ceased to be represented at the county court, and their role declined locally. So the sheriff then became much more powerful and overpowerful, particularly before John, when the kings spent most of the time on the continent. When the cat's away, the mice will play, and then they could then become a bit rogue, and that's when they're extorting more money than they should and oppressing people, and that's when the complaints start to pile up.
So it was Richard's fault, not John's.
Well, Henry, I like the two, Henry I, Henry II. They're two of my favourite monarchs. But Henry certainly builds on that centre, the Exchequer, having somebody to manage the centre and issue this writ. That's all of Saxony. The fact that the king could issue a bit of paper in his name with sealed, which would then be acted on in the locality, and send that maybe from Brittany, and it still be enacted in Newcastle, is a huge achievement, isn't it? So you would need a sheriff that could do that for you, but then they would also then be, they could go a bit wild at the edges. There's a fantastic sheriff. One of my other favourites is not the Sheriff of Nottingham. He's the Sheriff of Northumberland, William Heron, who was cited repeatedly for abuses of power. And there's in Newcastle Castle now, there's Heron's Pit, where if you fell foul of Mr. Heron, you were tossed into this pit and left there until you paid a ransom, in effect. And it got so bad that foreign traders wouldn't go to Newcastle or the north, so that they were avoiding the whole of Northumberland, and petitioned the king that if you want trade, we need to be protected from this guy, because he's doing as he likes, running amok. And he was reprimanded but not replaced.
Yeah.
Rein it in a bit, that's all.
I think in the end he lost the castles, didn't he? He had Newcastle and is it Tynemouth and a couple of other castles. That's a border shire. You would want a powerful voice there. And one of the roles of the sheriff was to command the sort of militia. We know that 2 or 3 Saxon sheriffs died at the Battle of Hastings fighting for Harold. So that military role did carry on. I forget the name of the sheriff, but it's the Sheriff of Cumberland that fought at the Battle of Boroughbridge, that won the battle there against the other Lancaster.
Oh, Harclay?
Yes, Harclay, that's him, yes. Because he becomes Earl of Cumbria, then he does a deal.
Yeah, he does a deal with the Scots, doesn't he? And he gets executed for treason.
He's gone from hero sheriff, winner, fighting my battles for me, to being executed. So yeah, Sheriff of Nottingham dies in office, and that's interesting in the Robin Hood stories, isn't it? The sheriff rarely dies. Generally made a fool of and mocked and made to look daft. The Robin Hood and the monk is a good one. He's Robin Hood and the Potter as well. The sheriff is a figure of derision. He's mocked and made to look foolish, but we don't want to kill him because we need him for the next story.
Yeah.
So we do need to keep him around. So you can kill his henchmen. It's okay to kill Guy of Gisborne or other people, but not the sheriff.
And Gisborne does usually come off as actually looking a lot worse even than the sheriff.
Yes, he's almost like a bounty hunter, I think, in the first book, and dies and has his head chopped off, and Robin sticks it on his bow. And we forget, Robin Hood is now kind of genteel. My granddaughter loves Robin Hood, but that's because he's a fox. He hasn't read Robin Hood and the Monk, where I think there's 15 deaths, and including the beheading of a page boy to the monk, who would have been 12 or something. These are rough and ready tales to be told in alehouses to an audience of men, I think.
So how much power did a sheriff wield? Was he the most powerful man in the county after the king?
Easily. Depends slightly, I suppose, on who else is around. William the Conqueror was quite good at making you, Earl of Warwick, but then not giving you that much power in Warwick and spreading your estates. The Saxons had suffered from this, hadn't they? Mercia, Wessex, these were massively powerful people in a concentrated area where they owned most of the land and wielded very considerable power and were over mighty subjects. Normans didn't really want that, so they spread their power base and deliberately built up the sheriffs. And I think they quickly learned that we don't want people like Peveril, who are big landowners in the area. I want maybe upstarts, I want new men, I want professionals coming in that will do the job and are totally beholden to me. I can rely on them, and I think that's the way they did it. It would depend again on the individual sheriff, how brutal they wanted to be. Generally, they have this administrative role, this tax role. Their role as the chief executive, in effect, of the county court was very important. The judicial power of the court, the county court, where most cases were settled, and that could be criminal matters and what we now consider civil matters, so that's disputes over land ownership and things like that. The sheriff could very strongly influence those. He could simply stop it being heard and prevent witnesses turning up, or he could get you to the front of the queue and have your case heard first. And the biggest weakness from the sort of public's point of view of the sheriff was that he wasn't paid, so he had to make money on fees and charges. So he's having to skim, and there's a staff to pay, and he has to uphold a certain. The sheriff couldn't have been, they couldn't have been some scruffy oik that turned up and demanded money. It's going to have to be, they're going to have to dress well, they have to look the part, horses and accoutrements and all the rest of it. So that's going to cost some money.
Yeah, and if they weren't big landowners, then they had to get their money from somewhere. Yeah. And if the king wants them to do the job but doesn't want to pay them,
the sheriff starts with these military strongmen. They become then financial agents and administrative roles, but they still need the power to make it happen. People didn't hand over money unless somebody turned up at the door with a sword or something in their hand and said, you do need to pay this. So they still needed that muscle element, but then became more sort of about accounting with the creation of the exchequer. The sheriff had to turn up at Winchester and account for the money. Yeah. They were minutely examined for how much the Crown thought they owed. Well, but yes, okay, I do owe you that, but I haven't managed to collect all of that, so I need those debts taken into consideration. Well, why haven't you collected them? You need to do it. And then my expenses, I'm going to then say, well, okay, I owe you this, but less I've had to pay. One of the sheriffs of York claims 5 shillings for a chain to bring somebody in. So, they were down to, I'm going to claim for every penny. So, yes, they had to account for that, and they were held accountable. There was examples of sheriffs out of office who have moved on and are still being brought back to say, well, hang on, where's this money gone? That you did owe this, that's not been paid. And they could then be liable for it, out their own money or being chucked in jail while they sorted it. So they were held accountable.
Yeah, the Red Book of the Exchequer, isn't it? It is actually available online on archive.org, and it's tedious reading, but it's interesting as well.
In it, he's saying, don't trust these sheriffs. They're all on the mate. And unless you bring them in and sit them down and make them answer, and they'll tell you, well, I can't come. My dog's sick and I can't come next week. Northumberland, that's not an easy commute.
No.
So they went, I think twice, the theory was. Firstly to settle the accounts and agree the money, and then the money was paid. There was a lot of this shipping money around as well. That always fascinates me. This money didn't come in pound notes, and this is pennies in barrels and wagon loads being shipped across the country to be sent into the Exchequer at Winchester. There's an account, Edward I is waging war in Wales, and he writes to the northern sheriff saying, don't send your money that you would normally send into Winchester, send it direct to me, because if it goes to Winchester, the accountants there are going to deduct my expenses. They're going to pay my bills and then send me what's left. And I need the ready cash. I need it now. I'm fighting a war. Send it all here. And the sheriffs are then saying, well, okay, I don't mind accounting for my money and sending it over to you. But, if Northumberland sends money to me at Nottingham, then I have to transfer it, and it turns out not to be right. It's like, Northumberland sent £100. I want to count that. So then Northumberland is thinking, hang on, there's 2 lots of accounting to agree it is the sum, and it would be, wagons of coins in barrels, mostly in pennies, handing it out. They then said, we don't want to go to Wales because Wales is warlike. If it all gets lost, you're going to blame us. So they agreed to take it to Chester. So they're then going to have to count it again, aren't they? £800 in all these barrels of pennies. Yeah, we'll take your word for it. They're going to go, no, we'll count this. And Nottingham's people are going to be leaning over the shoulder to make sure they do it right. That stuff fascinates me. All these little bits of paper, writs, money being counted. None of that's in any of these films with Alan Rickman's strutting around looking great. It counts bits of paper and bits of money. What the king's ultimately learned was that to get real money to wage wars on the continent, the 100 Years' Wars, what have you, that's a very expensive business. And these pennies that were coming in, a fee for this, there was a fee paid to cross the River Trent and the Trent Bridge, and some of that was owed to the Crown. And it's a lot of little bits of money, but it adds up to a lump sum for the Shire and then for the other Shire. So it's worth having, but it's not enough to wage war. And then what you then need is a big lump of money, which is a real tax. That's the tax on movables, which you needed consent for. That's when we start developing the idea of Parliament and these people. And then when those people are asked for this money, and they are burgesses, church, and barons and gentry, they've got complaints. And one of the top of the list of complaints is the sheriff. So if I want to get £50,000 to wage a war, every third or whatever, I'm going to have to take a rap for the sheriffs. And at that point, they learned it's not worth it. The light isn't worth the candle. That's, I think, when the sheriff then becomes a local man. They say, well, rather than me appointing someone to be my man in your shire, let's start appointing local people who is going to be really a pal of the people that he's supposed to be enforcing against. And the sheriffs then go rogue. They become local agents. So like Philip de Hedden, he's a local man, father and son both did the job. Very few complaints about them because they're hunting and dining with all of the rest of the Shire gentry, knights of the Shire people, and they become less of the king's agent and more of a local agent. There's two jobs the sheriff has still to do. We have a High Sheriff of Nottingham. One of them is to proclaim a new monarch at the death of the previous monarch. So Charles III was proclaimed by our High Sheriff here in Nottingham, and the other one is the writ for a general election, which calls the election, which is the legal basis for the election to be carried out, is delivered to the High Sheriff. So he transmits that to the returning officers in the local districts, and that triggers the election. So that was a power that they always organised the elections. The elections were conducted when they started calling parliaments. The knights of the shires were elected at the county court. The burgesses from the towns did their own thing. But that was a powerful group of people, and we talk about them being elected. There's going to be a dozen people in the room, all of similar status, and they're going to pick two people. And from what I see, sometimes they weren't always volunteers because, I don't want to go to spend the next 6 weeks in Westminster listening to people drone on. Well, it's like, someone needs to go because we've got to send somebody, and it's your turn.
Yeah.
I've been in these meetings where you think, they need someone to go and represent you at another meeting, and everybody sits there going, no. And the very keen one goes, well, I'll do it. Yeah, but your views don't quite fit the rest of us. So, Bolsheviks take over the government. So, and that was power under the Elizabethan parliaments. That she's often writing to sheriffs saying, look, who are these people you keep sending me to these parliaments? Why is Derbyshire sending two, Puritan extremists? I'm sure that's not the view of the Derbyshire gentry. Where are you getting these people from? And can you be a bit more careful about who you send?
I had no idea about that.
No. You mentioned that Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire came under one sheriff. Is that something that happened a lot?
It's one of these things, size matters. If you're a Sheriff of Lincolnshire, that's a huge county, isn't it? After Yorkshire. Yorkshire is huge, was the biggest. To be Sheriff of Yorkshire you'd have worn out some horse. And he must have had a permanent team of under-sheriffs that did some of this day-to-day work. The Sheriff of Yorkshire could never have done the job on that scale. So Nottinghamshire, relatively small shire, Derbyshire, small, relatively small. So there does seem to be this pairing. There are a number of examples of shires being joined together, and they seem to be a similar sort of size. The county court had to meet every 4 weeks, and there's a set timetable. That's interesting as well. One of the problems with county court was that, so like the Archbishop of York, for instance, would have an interest in a number of shires, and his man would be expected to attend Nottinghamshire County Court because of the land ownings he had here to represent his interests and to speak for his voice. But he couldn't be in Leicestershire on the same day. So they were fixed days. So Leicester met on a Monday and we met on a Tuesday, so that some of these people could go from A to B. not only have they got this judicial role, they provided a very solid political role of bringing together the political community of the Shire to give it a voice, which was eventually, formal. They sent people down to Westminster to act for them, but they could petition. Letters were sent. Copies of Magna Carta were sent to every sheriff, and the sheriff was instructed to read them out. Whether he would have been able to manage that himself or needed a clerk to read the Latin, but they were read. It's interesting, I think, that all the surviving copies of Magna Carta, the ones that survived were all sent to cathedrals, because the sheriffs were probably very haphazard with them and were opening and closing them and fiddling with them a lot, and they were stored in not necessarily appropriate places. So they didn't survive, whereas the cathedrals, I think Durham and Lincoln, very good examples. The monks probably took really good care of them and kept them nicely and didn't have to keep opening and fiddling with them. I was reading something of a letter Henry III wrote to Rutland, and he's addressing it to the gentlemen of Rutland, and it's intended to be read out at county court. He's offering assurances about sheriffs being appointed and the quality of people, and what he's trying to do is counter the fact that the Montfortian government has replaced royalist sheriffs with their own men, and Rutland wasn't happy about that. They liked who they got or whatever, and he's writing this letter, which was intended to be, I think, read to an assembly of people at the county court. So they're quite powerful, very useful institution that functioned. And the sheriff was the chief executive, bringing prisoners to the court, making sure witnesses turned up, just the physical catering to make sure that it ran on the day. That was down to the sheriff and his men.
I was going to ask what makes a good sheriff, and then I realised that a king's idea of a good sheriff is going to be different to the people's idea of a good sheriff, isn't it?
Philip Mark was a very good sheriff, if you ask King John, or his son. He kept him, so he did the job that they required of him. If you ask Nottinghamshire, they went to the trouble of getting his name into the charter. So you couldn't get a more extreme example than that. I suspect there were a lot of quietly good sheriffs who did the job, but without too much abuse, that actually took the order the king said, look, we've got to find the £100. Let's find it in the most painless way we can, and not make too many enemies. Heron is throwing people into the pit in order to extract money, but there were murderers and rapists and bandits attacking. Ordinary people couldn't go about their business because of criminality, and the sheriff was expected to deal with that. A number of petitions again saying, look, we've got this criminal problem and your sheriff hasn't dealt with it. He hasn't cracked down hard enough. And petitions saying, we want a tougher stand on law and order, which we want a tough sheriff when it comes. Everyone wants, if I'm driving fast, it's because I'm in a hurry and I'm late for something. If you're driving fast, you're speeding and you need fining. When I'm the victim of a crime, I need a tough, no-nonsense sheriff. When I'm bending the rules a bit, I need a sheriff that listens and can be a bit flexible. The nature of any enforcement is all things to all people is never possible.
So I suppose it's the ones who don't get in the Magna Carta as needing to be removed, or don't actually come to the notice, are probably the ones who are the good ones.
Yes, who just quietly went about the job. And you then go back to Robin Hood, where even the very earliest sources, even when there are clear references to Barnsdale and Yorkshire, and you can argue that Robin Hood has that strong Yorkshire link, the Sheriff of Nottingham is always there. And is he the sort of boogeyman sheriff of, there was this such a bad sheriff that he then becomes the archetypal sheriff for every bad officer going. And who was that? And, does that help us in any way sort of narrow the legend down a bit? I agree with you. I think there are lots of sheriffs who quietly went about their job and just were probably okay. And the districts, were quite happy that they paid their dues and he collected the money and the court ran and there was some sort of justice happening.
Yeah, and he skimmed off the top, but not too much, and things like that. So
10% we can live with. 20 is, you're taking the mickey, aren't you?
Yeah.
We've touched on the sheriff needing some form of income because of the expenses of the job, and also perhaps because the job, he needed to get something out of the job rather than ending up impoverished. So the thing is, of course, with the legend, the Sheriff of Nottingham is depicted as corrupt and extorting his citizens and so on. So do you think it was common? You've mentioned one or two extremes like Heron and Philip Mark, as we've said many times in Magna Carta, but is that something that sheriffs are they likely to be corrupt? Or is corrupt the wrong word because it's a 21st century take on what corruption means?
Yes, I think our take on corruption is different. There's certainly truth in the adage that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. If that went unchecked, the tendency is to take a bit more and a bit more and a bit more, and before you know it, a despot on you. And plenty of examples of that happening, particularly when the sheriffs had the ability to put people in jail, hold them pending trial, those kind of issues. And a number of shires are petitioning for that and saying the sheriff has overstepped the mark. So the king then has to weigh, if I back my man in the locality and uphold his authority, do I then risk losing the support of the gentry in the shire? And what do I weigh up? And that when rebellion's in the wind, when there's another faction, this could push people into the de Montfort's camp, or it could push them into the parliamentary opposition. So yeah, it's interesting that throughout the power of the sheriff is whittled away, because they bring in so the decision to put somebody in jail pending a trial is taken away from the sheriff and given to the justices. The courts aren't functioning as well as they should, so they start sending out itinerant judges to do the tours and the assizes. So there is that reform always seems to leave the sheriff with less power than he started with. And when they are collecting a big tax, there's a parliamentary agreement that they will collect a tenth of movables or whatever. That's rarely in the hands of the sheriff. They appoint commissioners to do that, because they want all of the money, and they don't want sticky fingers in between, and B, they want sort of a fresh eye on the shire to make sure that the right people are paying and everyone's paying their fair share. So where we end up kind of today, we've got a high sheriff with absolutely no job, because a piece of the job has been removed. The policing role went to police, the courts, the judges do all of that. So the sheriff ends up with next to nothing. So I think that does tell you that it didn't work as well as it should have done.
Yeah, it's also a kind of, the gradual centralisation of government over the centuries leads us to the point we're at now, whereas as you said, we started in Saxon and Norman times with needing somebody on the ground who could control matters, all sorts of matters, as you've described. Now we're at the other extreme of central government really having a finger in most pies.
If you ask sort of the man in the street, the Clapham omnibus person, it's the little stuff that bugs them the most, isn't it? It's all right having, the Prime Minister jets off to an international conference of the G7 and they discuss whatever, but there's this pothole. What is pothole? The water's off on my tap. And I think it's an adage, and all government is ultimately local. That's what people worry about. I can look at the news and worry about things happening overseas, but is the electric on? Is the tap running? Does the bus turn up on time? Those are the little things. So the medieval period, there was very little of that to worry about. If I could get from Mansfield to Southall to go to the shrine to visit the cathedral safely by travelling that road, that was okay. If I couldn't do that because of bandits and robbers and what have you, then I had a complaint to the government.
So did he have to be a bit of a jack of all trades, knowing everything about the county and having his fingers in everything so that he knew what was going on, not just with law and order, but like you say, with taxes, with markets?
Yes, and they would, they would have to have that. And one of the interesting things is that I suspect, again, that the sheriffs, many of them weren't in the office for very long. Some of them had long periods of being in post, but some of them changed quite regularly. And there was a move having them annually. But then they have, they're not on top of the job, aren't they? So I suspect then there were clerks, and very few of those names crop up. But I think that acquired knowledge of who you could be relied on, who would turn up, who's got a beef. It's like saying, okay, these two judges, someone's accusing someone of this, and it's like, well, hang on, he's always doing that, or this is a family feud that goes back 50 years, And Mark was completely an alien, wasn't he? He came in completely fresh to England. He was a Gascon, I think. So he would come in with no English, assumingly, and a completely, he would have no friends in the Shire, which meant he wasn't favourite. He had no favourites, but he equally didn't know any of the undercurrents, and it's when you're doing that's easy to disturb the balance of power. I think there's definitely a team of maybe undersheriffs that stayed in the role longer, perhaps more likely to be local people that they saw it just as a job and took pay from the sheriff. They were paid, and some of the clerks, some of the financial clerks, and it looks like there were clerks. There's references to clerks doing finance and clerks doing writs, and maybe some of them kept the books of writs and understood what the paperwork was. So there's got to be this accumulation of knowledge. So I think the Shire Hall is, there were people there that were probably in those roles for much, much longer than the sheriff was. And at one point, there's a chap called William Brewer. He was sheriff for about 20 odd shires. And then obviously he had no intention of visiting them and doing that job, was he? He's taking those as perks and taking the money, but not doing the work. So he's appointing a deputy sheriff to do the donkey work and then taking money without any intention of going anywhere near the shires. And as examples, I think Richard was selling sheriffdoms. There's a couple of cases where they bought the sheriffdom and paid for it. They paid to have the job. They've still got to pay the revenue from the shire into the exchequer, and they're also expecting to make a profit. And they don't. And they then say, hang on, I want to be absolved from this. I know I bought it for a year, but it isn't worth it. It's too much like hard work. I thought it would be an easy, cushy job, and it's not. And can I have my money back? Or here's the job back.
Richard sold everything. He would have sold London if he could.
I wear the chain, and all of the images of the sheriff in all the films or whatever show him wearing a chain of office. So that's why I like it. But no evidence of that. I've seen no references to any sort of sheriff symbols of office or anything. There's references to a seal, a number of references to sheriffs having a seal. So whether that was a seal of the office belonging to the shrievalty and then it was handed over to the next sheriff, or whether it was sort of Philip Mark had his own personal seal and did it. But how would you know that this person who's riding up to your gate demanding lodging is actually the sheriff?
That's true.
You would, Philip Mark would have turned up out of the blue. He's appointed, he arrives, there must have been a proclamation saying, a letter of instruction. They had to swear an oath, and there's a number of examples of the oaths being tightened up and having to swear them in county court, and swearing to, do justice to everybody without fear and favour and this kind of thing. Yeah. So they did try those sort of techniques, but I've not come across any references to symbols of office. But it would be nice to find, but apart from the seal, there's a number of references to that.
That is something to look into. So who was your favourite medieval sheriff? After Nicola de la Haye, of course. I
do like Mark. It's not necessarily about a favourite, is it? It's about the most interesting. He's an interesting character because he has, the darker side and the other sort of makes him more interesting. So I like Mark. I like the fact that he was ultra loyal. He held on to his duties on the continent after everybody else had legged it. John himself had given up and come, but he held on. He was then rewarded, and having been rewarded, given this job here, a complete stranger to the county, had no links here, no family ties, nothing, probably not even English, and just did the job effectively, but did it well enough that John kept him. Despite, he could have sacrificed him and think, okay, I'll throw him to the wolves because that might placate some barons and win me a bit of favour in negotiations around Magna Carta. He didn't. He hung on to him. And then his son hung on to him as well, which means William Marshall did, didn't he? I mean, that decision would have been Marshall's. So they're thinking, okay, he's got a reputation, but we need some effective, strong government. This is a a boy king who needs people that will get things done. So we'll keep Mark. So yeah, fascinating character, one that someone should write a book about.
It is a fascinating area of medieval history that doesn't often get covered. So it's actually been wonderful to be able to talk to you, my Lord Sheriff, about your duties and roles and how it's changed over time. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you very much, Richard Townsley, our wonderful Sheriff of Nottingham, or more accurately, Sheriff of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire. And I'll see you in Sherwood at some point, I am sure, because the Robin Hood Festival is on over the summer. Every summer, the Robin Hood Festival is well worth a visit. So thank you very much, my Lord Sheriff. Do join us next time when we will be chatting with Angus Donald about his latest book and how a former English Templar knight came to join the Mongol horde of Genghis Khan. I've been Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. Thank you very much for listening today. And if you enjoyed our podcast, why not subscribe to ensure you don't miss the next one? Goodbye.